In this passage, we encounter that thorny word, predestined. Presbyterians have been known as Christians who hold on to the doctrine of predestination. Christians of all stripes often took predestined to mean that God chose some people to eternal life. From this understanding, it went all the way in some Christian circles that if God chose some people to eternal life, those who were not chosen would be destined to eternal damnation or rejection. This latter understanding is known as double predestination and is often attributed to Calvin for highlighting it theologically. In a way, the world sees Presbyterians as Calvinists who are stuck on this idea of double predestination. Whether someone will end up in heaven or hell began with the Jewish understanding of election or God's choice of the people of Israel as God's people. For the most of the Old Testament times, the people of Israel were not concerned with life after death. They were concerned mainly with life between birth and death and how their lives ought to be lived as God's chosen people among many peoples. They were not concerned about whether they were going to heaven or hell. Much later, before the time of Jesus, some Jews began to debate if there were life after death. Christians inherited this notion of being chosen by God. They added a new understanding that they were chosen through Jesus, as well as it was only possible to enter into eternal life through Him alone. During the Reformation, Reformed and Presbyterian Christians insisted on the notion of sovereignty of God, where God freely decided, foreordained is the word we often use, everything that is to happen in life. With this came another understanding that God's mind was unchangeable. This theological concept was further developed in the Presbyterian doctrine to say that before the world was created, God decided who would enjoy eternal life while the rest would be rejected and would be headed to hell. For a long while in history, from the time of Reformation until the late 20th century, this idea of God's choice or election was not only used as good news for those who were opened to be baptized into the church, but also as a threat against those who were not interested in joining Christianity in any form. Calvin was very careful as he explained about predestination that people ought not to try to explain away what it meant, but to take it as God's mystery that ought to remain a mystery. However, once this cat was let out of the bag, so to speak, it created all kinds of difficulties in mission as well as in understanding Christian life in the world of many religions and later in secularism where atheism and agnosticism became strong. From the beginning of Christian history, who belonged to God through Christ was a very contentious notion. For Christians, going to heaven or headed towards hell became a real concern. The leadership of the church learned to exploit this situation very well throughout history because they saw the power in declaring who belonged and could not belong to the church. The power to divide sheep from goats was irresistible since everyone desired to belong to the right group. In the Old Testament time, dividing sheep from goats was not as refined and controversial. Those who did not keep God's commands knew they would be punished. The people of Israel understood more or less that they had an added burden of being God's chosen, who had to abide by God's law, unlike all others. Eternal life was not in their horizons. By the time Jesus began his ministry, some people began discussing life after death and who might or might not be able to enjoy it. Among the Jews of Jesus' time, Sadducees did not believe in eternal life or resurrection. Pharisees and other Jews began understanding that those who were faithful in keeping the law would inherit eternal life, while those who did not keep the law would not. In the meantime, in Greco-Roman world, philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and others were thinking deeply about afterlife in dramatically different ways than the Jews. Plato was able to construct an elaborate scheme of where human souls went after death. Today's understanding about how the souls of dead people go to a heavenly abode is influenced far more from this Greek understanding than the Christian one. Elsewhere, in Buddhism, life after death was thought in terms of possibilities in gaining nirvana. In Hinduism, those who die would be incarnated in forms that befit for their lives as rewards or punishments. That is known as karma. If you behave today in this life, you will be rewarded in the next life. If you do wrong in this life, you will be reincarnated into the caste that is below today's rank and have to bear more suffering. For Christians, Jesus preached that God's reign was at hand and that those who believed in him would enjoy this reign of God. Initially, Christians preached that the good news was this invitation to believe Jesus and be part of God's reign. Once the church grew and its hierarchy was systematized, identifying those who were part of the church as opposed to those who were outside became important. We could easily see why, in some ways, the teaching of predestination would confer privilege to some and not to others. Christianity became the state religion of Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. From that time on, it was understood by both Christians and Roman leaders that God would be on their side. Like other Roman gods, the Christian God was to protect and prosper Roman citizens. Whenever and wherever Roman soldiers won over other nations, those who lost were forced to become Christians. Knowing God was on Roman Empire's and later the Holy Roman Empire's side, the doctrine of predestination was of interest only to theologians. Most Christians did not pay attention to this highly theoretical and abstract teaching. The time of Reformation brought different conflicts as the Reformers and their followers struggled against the Roman Catholic Church and its followers. Distinguishing true Christians from false ones became important. In this struggle within the Church, Reformers like Calvin revisited the doctrine of predestination. Eventually, it was expressed in starker terms. This teaching became a tool by which ordinary Christians could argue why their side was God's elect. Presbyterians had this doctrine enshrined in its founding document known as Westminster Confession of Faith. Today, this doctrine is one of the foundational teachings for many faithful Presbyterians. Though many of these brothers and sisters in Presbyterian churches have been very careful to note that God alone knows the identities of the elect, there have been many attempts to explain differences in actions between the elect and the rest. In many subtle ways, we have been codifying, classifying, defining, and organizing beliefs, rules, behaviors, and actions to impose this doctrine of predestination in daily lives. That is, if one agrees and accepts certain teachings that meet specific criteria, that individual is seen to be part of the elect. If a person is considered to hold heretical views or make non-orthodox arguments, she is suspected and is seen as not on God's side. In history, by institutionalizing this chosenness as God's people, we have created severe chasm between those who are chosen in this understanding of God's election and those who are not chosen. More we have defined the qualities as chosen people for clarity, more we ended up hurting by excluding so many others. fighting over where to draw the line has caused more harm to those with whom we have disagreed, even on very minor points. We did lose the grace that was to be shone through the doctrine over continual fights on matters of who ought to belong as God's chosen. Inevitably, rather than sharing God's grace, Jesus and Paul were trying to teach, we ended up trying to recruit God to our side. Our history of 2,000 years is full of how so many were falsely accused and harmed because we were bravely drawing the line between the chosen and the damned. Rather than being like Jesus and Paul, bringing the good news to all, we ended up usurping God's authority and proclaimed our understanding as God's judgments against those with whom we disagree. Often, we are called back to remember that the predestination was to help us to experience God's grace. We need to return to experiencing that mystery of God's grace each time we speak of it. As Paul says in this passage, it is God who justifies. However, many Christians, especially devout Presbyterians, are sure that there are visible signs which distinguish the elect of God from the rest. This is how we have functioned in the past few centuries. In the past, these visible signs included one's presence at Sunday worship, participation in communion, contribution to church finances, and so on. Today, for many Christians, these widely accepted visible signs no longer indicate one's belonging to God's elect. In our secular age, many Christians find it troublesome to display or identify their faith in public with those churches with clear and certain beliefs, while many other Christians do find it meaningful to live their faith out publicly. What we are discovering in this age of information, as the entire world is wired together through this internet, is that whatever we believe and however we express what we believe, there are those who agree with us. That is, it is clear that everyone can find a validation of one's view on faith from someone somewhere. It is no longer possible to simply appeal to a particular authority on my faith and be justified. We can no longer point to our baptismal certificate or our attendance in worship or Bible studies, to our degrees or our good work with the poor or the marginalized, or to our pious acts in order to argue that God is on our side. Our categorical justifications, arguments, theories, and teachings no longer are sufficient in this world to demonstrate that God's on our side. What is clear is that whatever we do in faith, however we act to share the good news of Christ, or why we go out to help our neighbors in need, are not the signs or indications that God is on our side. They are merely expressions of our belief and manifestations of our desires in faith. In this way, we come to understand that it is essential for us to be humble. We live in a world not that different from the time of Jesus and Paul, where through their lives and teaching, they were able to let others see what God was doing among all those other religions, philosophies, and rituals. As was the case with Jesus and Paul in their world, where very few knew the teachings of Jesus, we too humbly live in our world, sharing and living as Jesus and Paul did, in order that these teachings come alive, so that God justifies what we do in God's own way. It is no longer necessary to hang on to this doctrine of predestination as the definitive understanding on whether God is on our side or we are God's elect. It ought to be sufficient to hear Paul say, "It is God who justifies," and leave everything that we do to speak for itself as a sign of God's present grace in the world.